The inconvenient immortality of Cronus long before Mount Olympus was claimed by a new generation of deities with chiseled physiques and questionable moral judgment. There was an older order, a quieter, slower world governed not by thunderbolts or oaths sworn on the river Styx, but by forces that moved like sediment, constant, heavy, and deeply inconvenient. At the center of this slow-turning wheel was Cronus. Not Zeus, not Apollo, not even Cronus, a titan, son of Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. Cronus lived in an age that modern myths barely remember, and perhaps that's for the best. It was not a glamorous time. There were no great feasts, no grand temples, no golden layers echoing through marble halls. There was instead time, endless, stretching time. Cronus was born into a world of inevitability. His father Uranus, personification of the heavens, was not exactly paternal. He treated his children, the Titans, as liabilities, locking them away inside Gaia's vast, earthen body. Their groans echoed in caves, their limbs bent against the granite ribs of the earth. Uranus feared their strength, and perhaps more so, the change they represented. You see, the cosmos in its earliest form hated disruption. Cronus, however, came to embody it. With Gaia's quiet encouragement, Cronus eventually took a sickle crafted of adamantine, that mysterious and durable metal, and did what the myths graciously call severing his father's power. It was not a clean job. According to Hesiod, he cut his father's members, tossing them into the sea, where they eventually gave birth to Aphrodite and a number of other aquatic oddities. But we're not here to marvel at foam-born beauty. We're here for a bureaucracy, paranoia, and the slow corrosion of trust. Cronus took his father's place as ruler of the cosmos. But power, once seized, never settles quietly. Gaia had warned him of a prophecy, that one day, a child of his own would overthrow him. Cronus, who had literally overthrown his own father, understood how plausible this was. So he did what any cautious, pragmatic immortal would do. He ate his children, one by one, not metaphorically, not through neglect, literally. Each time his wife, Rhea, gave birth first to Hestia, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, he would wrap the infant in a cloth, swallow it whole, and go about his day. This wasn't out of cruelty. Cronus wasn't a sadist. He was a conservative. He had tasted revolution and found it exhausting. Better to keep things the way they were, predictable, digestible, quiet. Rhea, to her credit, objected. But objections don't often carry weight in a world where time itself devours possibility. So she waited. When Zeus was born, her sixth child, she presented Cronus with a swaddled stone instead. Cronus, presumably distracted, perhaps mid-yawn, swallowed the rock. Zeus, meanwhile, was spirited away to a cave on the island of Crete, where he was raised by a goat named Amalthea, and attended by armed dancers who banged their shields to cover his infant cries. This was how revolutions began in myth, slowly, underground, beneath layers of deception and goat milk. While Zeus grew in secret, Cronus ruled a world that felt increasingly fragile. The other titans respected his authority, but fear is a short-lived glue. Cronus' mills sat uneasily within him. The swallowed gods were alive, immortal, and presumably a bit annoyed. Historians and poets alike gloss over the dull years of Cronus' reign. There were no great wars, no conquests. Just a great, looming silence. The Golden Age, they called it, though one suspects the label was retroactive. Golden, because it was quiet. Golden because it was remembered only through myth, not memory. During this time, the world operated like a bureaucratic mechanism. Seasons came and went in predictable cycles. Mortals tilled fields, rivers flowed, titans, bored and half forgotten, pursued odd hobbies, building mountains, inventing constellations, sulking in forests. There were no Olympian politics, no divine jealousies, no mortal heroes to distract from the crawl of time. And yet, something stirred. In the caverns of Mount Ida, Zeus grew, not just in size, but in thought. He learned the patience of goats and the discipline of being hidden. He learned to listen to wind patterns and the conversations of ants. These were not Olympian virtues, but they were useful all the same. Cronus, for all his obsession with control, could not feel the slow ferment of rebellion within him. The gods within his stomach were not digesting, they were waiting. Time, it turns out, digests nothing when it is itself the container. As Zeus approached adulthood, he began planning. Not with fury, not with wrath, but with caution. The overthrow of a titan would require precision, allies, and a very specific emetic. According to myth, it would eventually involve a clever mixture prepared by Metis, a tightness of wisdom and deep thought, which caused Cronus to vomit up his fully grown children. But that's not this section. That's not yet. We remain in the time of waiting, in the uneasy calm of a ruler who has everything and trusts nothing. Cronus sat upon his throne, perhaps made of basalt, perhaps metaphorical, and listened to the silence. The Titan of time, burdened by immortality, watched the horizon for changes he could neither prevent nor predict. He had swallowed change, but digestion does not equal destruction. Inside him, the future churned, hidden away in the caves of Mount Ida. Far from the gilded calm of Cronus' realm, Zeus grew unseen, unheard, and perhaps most dangerously, unbothered. Rhea's deception had worked. For the first time in ages, something had slipped past the ever-watchful eyes of time. Raised by the goat Amalthea, Zeus learned his first lessons, not from books or sermons, but from the mountain itself. The bleating of goats was his lullaby, moss-covered. Stones were his furniture. The Melia, nymphs of ash trees, whispered lullabies and warnings in equal measure. And always, the curate psalm dancers loyal to Rhea performed their strange ritual, clashing bronze against bronze to mask the boys' cries. If Cronus had ever grown suspicious, he gave no sign. But the silence in his stomach deepened. 5 gods swam there in agitated immortality. They were neither digesting nor dying, merely waiting, like bureaucrats in a closed office, wondering when someone would finally return with the paperwork. Meanwhile, Zeus grew clever. He was not raised in the opulence of Olympus, nor in the power-soaked halls of the Titans. His childhood was an exercise in stillness and observation. He learned from insects, from clouds, from the patience of trees. There is a kind of intelligence that grows in quiet places, strategic, long-viewed, deliberate. Zeus was not yet the thunder-wielding tyrant of later myth. He was a survivalist. Eventually, Metis entered the story, a tightness of cunning and wisdom. She embodied the sort of knowledge that creeps rather than shouts. It was Metis who recognized in Zeus not just strength, but timing. She saw the moment approaching, the moment when silence would shift, when waiting would become action. Under her guidance, Zeus concocted a potion. The recipe is lost to time, but myth tells us it was designed to loosen Cronus' grip, not metaphorically, but physically. It was an emetic, brewed with purpose. The plan was simple: get Cronus to drink it, and let nature or perhaps justice take its course. But first, Zeus needed to confront his father. It's worth imagining this meeting. Cronus, massive and slow, carved by centuries of divine caution, facing a stranger whose features vaguely resembled Rhea. Perhaps there was recognition in his eyes, perhaps not. Either way, Cronus drank. The results were immediate. From his mouth, fully formed and undoubtedly disgruntled, emerged Zeus' siblings Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Imagine the disorientation. You have been inside someone's stomach for decades, completely conscious, and now you're standing upright, blinking in a world that's changed. But not enough. There was no time for orientation. The gods who had once been meals became allies. In the blink of a cosmic eye, they formed an alliance with Zeus at the head. And just like that, Cronus' carefully arranged order swallowed, suppressed, silenced, was shattered. What followed was not a battle. It was a war. 10 years of shifting alliances, chaotic skirmishes, and divine weaponry. A generational conflict of cosmic scale. The Titanomach. Why? The old Titans sided with Cronus, not all, but many. Oceanus, the river that encircles the world, remained neutral. But others, Hyperion, Iapetus, Zeus, stood beside their brother. Together, they represented the old order, immovable, patient, unchanging. Zeus and his siblings, meanwhile, represented something else: rebellion, momentum, the uncomfortable promise of evolution. They took residence atop Mount Olympus, a tall, remote seat from which they would wage their campaign. The war was not noble. It was not swift. And, to be honest, it was likely quite boring between skirmishes. You don't fight eternal beings with spears and shields alone. You fight them with ideas, alliances, and attrition. And sometimes, with very large boulders. Zeus eventually sought reinforcements. He freed the Cyclopes, the one-eyed craftsman who had been imprisoned by Cronus. In Tartarus, in gratitude, they gifted him thunder and lightning, a fitting, if flashy, arsenal for a sky god in the making. Poseidon received a trident that could shake the earth. Hades, a helmet of invisibility. These weren't just weapons. They were symbols of rule. Still, even with these advantages, the war dragged on. What made it so slow? Perhaps it was the nature of the enemy. Titans were not quick. They were elemental. They moved like glaciers. They didn't fall, they eroded. Cronus in particular fought, not like a warrior, but like a bureaucrat. He stalled. He obfuscated. He denied the inevitability of succession. With all the stubbornness of a fading empire. It took a final assault to tip the balance. A concentrated offensive led by Zeus and his siblings, bolstered by the 100-handed Hecatonchius, whom they had also freed from Tartarus. These monstrous allies could throw hundreds of boulders at once. A helpful, if messy, strategy. Cronus fell, the Titans were overthrown, and the world changed. Though perhaps not as much as everyone expected. Zeus did not kill Cronus. Some say he imprisoned him in Tartarus, deep within the earth's caverns. Others say he exiled him to the edges of the world, to rule over forgotten lands and fading memories. Either way, Cronus remained immortal. That was the problem. He couldn't die. Time itself, after all, has no grave. The gods claimed Olympus and began the slow, administrative work of reshaping reality. They created laws, argued over domains, held meetings that resembled divine family therapy. It was not glamorous. Hera demanded clarity. Poseidon wanted better sea zoning. Hades, disgruntled by his subterranean assignment, negotiated terms. Zeus took the throne, but he did so with a lesson branded into his thoughts. Power, once seized, must be guarded. Just as Cronus had swallowed his children to prevent prophecy, Zeus began watching for his own. He married Metis. Then, when warned that her child would surpass him, he swallowed her. And so the cycle resumed. Immortality, it seemed, did not grant freedom from fear, only a longer time to dwell on it. Cronus, though defeated, was not erased. When you are time itself, or at least a very old metaphor for it, you are not so easily discarded. The Olympians, now enthroned atop Mount Olympus, inherited a world that had been shaped by his anxieties, his suspicions, and, most persistently, his patterns. They may have claimed victory, but what they inherited was a system once still functioning on the leftovers of the old regime. Zeus, now king of the gods, faced a curiously familiar dilemma. He, too, was warned that his offspring might one day usurp him. The oracle's prophecy was clear. The child he conceived with Metis' tightness of clever counsel would become greater than its father. And Zeus, despite all his rhetoric of change and order, did not break the cycle. He swallowed Metis, unlike Cronus, however, who consumed his children out of fear and inertia. Zeus performed his act with strategy. Metis was not yet pregnant. She was wisdom itself, and in consuming her, Zeus believed he could internalize wisdom without birthing risk. It was a bureaucratic solution, tidy on parchment, impossible in practice. Metis lived on inside him. Soon, a terrible headache overtook Zeus. It was not metaphorical. His temples throbbed with divine tension. When he finally split his skull open by axe, no less Athena emerged, fully grown and armored. A child not just of Zeus, but of Metis as well. The first of a new kind, a god born of thought and strategy, not chaos. It was ironic. In trying to avoid the prophecy, Zeus had fulfilled it, but in a new form. Athena, unlike Zeus or Cronus, had no interest in thrones. She would become the goddess of wisdom, of ordered war, of cities and planning. The cycle hadn't been broken, but it had evolved. Meanwhile, what of Cronus? The myths diverge. Some say he was cast into Tartarus, a gloomy prison deep beneath the underworld, where stone walls echo endlessly and time slows into tedium. There, he joined his siblings, those titans who had stood with him in the war. Their punishment was not pain, but irrelevance. They became stories barely told, names etched into marble footnotes. Other versions are more charitable. In some traditions, Cronus was exiled to the Isles of the Blessed, a far western paradise where retired immortals dwelled in dreamless rest. There, he ruled in peace, a faded god presiding over a world that required no ruling. And yet, his legacy endured. Time remained a force, unruled by any god. Even Zeus, for all his sky-splitting power, could not slow its passage. Gods grew bored, mortals died, empires rose and crumbled. Cronus' reign may have ended, but his influence shaped everything that came after. You might imagine him now sitting somewhere at the edge of myth, in a quiet place where nothing much happens. Perhaps he tends a garden, perhaps he simply waits. He's still immortal, after all. He can wait forever. Cronus represents something older than Olympus, something buried beneath marble columns and golden statues. He represents the quiet dread that change is always coming, that even gods can be replaced, outwitted, consumed by the very mechanisms they create to preserve themselves. Zeus would rule Olympus, but he, too, became what he fought. He grew suspicious of his children. He tested their loyalty. He punished Prometheus for giving fire to mankind, not because it was wrong, but because it disrupted the order. An echo of Cronus swallowing his children to prevent disruption. This is how myths breathe, not in grand gestures, but in patterns that repeat through generations. The story of Cronus is not just about eating children or losing wars. It is about systems built on fear, and the long, slow unraveling of those fears into something slightly more modern, but never quite new. By the time mortals came to worship the Olympians in stone temples and marble forums, the Titans had become shadows, figures buried beneath layers of interpretation. Priests spoke of Zeus, of Athena, of Apollo. Cronus, he was mentioned only in cautious whispers, if at all. Yet, farmers still marked the passage of seasons by the sickle. The grain was still harvested under Saturn's gaze. Saturn, being the Roman name for Cronus, now softened into a symbol of time and sowing. In Rome, Saturn was not feared, but celebrated. During the festival of Saturnalia, roles were reversed, and masters served slaves. Time itself was mocked, its linear march temporarily suspended. The Romans, it seemed, understood something the Greeks never quite settled. That time is not an enemy, but a pattern to be acknowledged, even playfully. Back in Greece, the old myths settled into parchment. Homer rarely mentioned Cronus. Hesiod gave him a grim dignity. Philosophers preferred to discuss more useful metaphors. But among the elderly, and perhaps among those who felt the slow ache of change, Cronus lingered, his sickle not as a weapon, but as a reminder. In the end, Cronus was never truly defeated. How do you defeat time? You don't. You absorb it. You forget it. You name it something else and pretend it's gone. And yet, in the silence between stories, when the thunder has stopped and the wine has run dry, You might still feel his presence there. Long pause before something new begins, the hesitation before change. That is Cronus, still waiting. Eros looked at her, at the lamp, at the betrayal. Not of love, but of the one condition he had asked, trust. Without a word, he fled. Psyche called after him, but the palace faded. The voices vanished. She was left alone again, this time with the terrible knowledge that she had broken something she didn't yet understand. And so, we end here. Psyche, abandoned, determined, and unsure if true love can ever be repaired. Psyche had lost everything. Not her life, no gods had struck her down, but the invisible palace was gone. Its fine walls and warm voices dissolved like morning mist. The god who had once whispered to her in the darkness had vanished into the skies. And perhaps worst of all, she now knew who he had been. Not a monster. Not Adeceive. Eros. The god of love himself. It is a particular kind of punishment to realize, only after a mistake, how rare, how fragile, and how true something was. And yet, unlike the countless mortals in myth who simply faded into regret, Psyche did something that very few figures in Greek myth ever attempted after losing favor with the gods. She tried to make it right. She wandered the world on foot, unsheltered, uncelebrated. She sought temples, oracles, whispers in the market. She asked the priests of Apollo, the servants of Hera, even the weary gatekeepers of obscure shrines, whether any had seen Eros. None had. What she did not know was that Eros, wounded from the drop of oil, had returned to his mother's home. Aphrodite, ever dramatic, discovered her son's disobedience, and she was furious. Not only had Eros failed to punish Psyche as ordered, he had fallen in love with her, revealing himself to a mortal. This, for Aphrodite, was personal. She found Psyche wandering and had her brought to her temple. Here, the goddess of beauty, now scorned and made ridiculous in her own eyes, decided to teach Psyche a lesson. A series of tasks, impossibly dull, impossibly dangerous. Psyche accepted. This is what makes her story remarkable, not grand gestures or sudden strength, but endurance. There are no monsters to slay, no seas to part, no thunderbolts to wield. Just tasks. The first task, sorting the seeds. A great heap of seeds was poured before her: barley, millet, lentils, beans, poppy, wheat, all jumbled together in a single, chaotic pile. Sort them, Aphrodite said. By nightfall, this wasn't a test of strength. It was a test of patience. A deliberately boring, overwhelming task meant to humiliate her. And yet, help arrived. Tiny ants, thousands of them, crawled across the floor and, wordlessly, began to sort the seeds, row by row, grain by grain, not because Psyche commanded them, but because they pitied her. Even insects, it seemed, recognized sincerity. By nightfall, the pile was arranged. Aphrodite was displeased but said nothing. The second task, gathering the golden fleece. Next, Psyche was told to collect golden wool from a flock of violent, sun-blinded rams who grazed along a riverbank. These were not docile creatures. They trampled without warning and crushed without remorse. But again, nature intervened, not out of awe, but compassion. A river spirit warned Psyche to wait until late afternoon, when the rams slept. She did, and from the branches they'd brushed against, she quietly gathered tufts of fleece. Aphrodite accepted the wool, teeth clenched. The third task, the waters of the Styx. This time, Psyche was sent to fetch water from the river Styx, the boundary between the living and the dead. Mortal hands could not survive the ascent to its source, nor touch its water, but an eagle sent perhaps by Zeus or by Eros in secret swooped down, seized the flask from Psyche's trembling hands, and flew into the mountains. It returned filled with black, trembling water. And still, Psyche did not give up. Each task was mundane in concept and maddening in execution. She did not fight dragons. She climbed hills. She waited. She listened. But the final trial was the most dangerous of all. The fourth task, a box of beauty from the underworld. Aphrodite, whose vanity knew no bounds, claimed she had grown haggard from worrying. She instructed Psyche to travel to the realm of Hades and request a portion of Persephone's beauty, sealed in a box. A final test, a near-certain death. No mortal returned from the underworld. That was the rule, but Psyche, armed with resignation, more than bravery, set off anyway. She carried coins in her mouth for Charon, the boatman. She brought cakes of honeyed barley for Cerberus, the three-headed hound. She resisted the pleas of wandering shades and ignored the cries for help. She followed the instructions, whispered to her in dream, and entered Persephone's palace with humility. Persephone, queen of the dead, welcomed her calmly. She handed over the box without fuss, even offering her a seat, but Psyche, aware of how easily one could be trapped by comfort in that place, refused the food, took the box, and left. She had succeeded. All she had to do was bring the box back to Aphrodite. But now the story turns. As Psyche walked back toward the world, the box began to weigh on her, not in mass, but in thought. She wondered, could she not open it? Just a crack, take a sliver of divine beauty for herself. She was exhausted, hollow-eyed. She had walked through the land of the dead. Would it not help to be beautiful again? She opened the box. It contained no beauty. Only sleep, a deep, dreamless sleep poured out and overwhelmed her. She collapsed by the roadside. The box still clutched in her hand. It would have ended there. Another tale of mortal overreach, a quiet end in the dust. But Eros had been watching, wounded but healing. He had heard of her labors, her endurance, her silence. He flew to her, no longer hidden, no longer afraid. He brushed the sleep from her eyes, kissed her forehead, and whispered her name. Psyche awoke. Together, they completed the journey. Eros, now fully recovered, brought Psyche to Olympus, not as a mortal, not as a mistake, but as someone who had earned her place. Zeus himself presided. He offered Psyche a cup of ambrosia, the drink of the gods. With it, she became immortal, not a goddess of thunder or revenge, not of the sea or harvest, but of the soul. Psyche. The soul that endured, waited, learned, and yet, one wonders, is love ever truly earned? Or does it merely find its shape in suffering? And so, the girl who once wandered alone, unloved and unsure, now stood on Olympus. Zeus, with all his thunderous presence, had offered her ambrosia, the drink of immortality. It was a quiet moment, no trumpets, no fanfare, just a cup, an outstretched hand, and a god acknowledging something rare, that a mortal, through patience and persistence, had climbed to the realm of the divine, not by birthright, but by endurance. Psyche drank. Her limbs did not blaze with divine fire. She did not grow wings or summon winds. Immortality arrived slowly, like breath, like thought, like the soul itself. She simply remained, whole, awake, permanent. Her marriage to Eros was celebrated among the gods, not with wild revelry, but with a certain reserved curiosity. After all, Eros had never taken a wife. He had only wielded love like a tool, sharp and inevitable. Now, he stood beside someone who had not only resisted him, but who had found her way to him. Hera gave a nod. Hermes toasted her quietly. Apollo, perhaps, played a tune that no one would remember, but which warmed the corners of the great hall. Aphrodite said nothing for a long time. And then, eventually, she approved, not because she had grown fond of Psyche, but because something in the girl's quiet suffering reminded her of her own eternal position, beloved, envied, worshipped, and, in the end, alone. Psyche had not stolen worship. She had endured the weight of it, then let it go. The tension dissolved. Eros and Psyche settled into a quiet corner of Olympus, not prominent among the marble columns and high courts, but not forgotten either. Their home was said to be on the slopes of the mountain, where wildflowers grew, and winds moved without urgency. They had a daughter, Hedone, the goddess of pleasure, not indulgence, not chaos, but a softer kind of delight. A product not just of desire, but of endurance, of love earned, not merely sparked. And then, not much else. The story ends there. At least in the myths. There were no great wars waged in their name, no cities destroyed, no curses hurled across generations. Eros continued his work guiding desire, sometimes carelessly, sometimes with more thought. Psyche remained as a presence, a soul at rest, but alert. It is worth pausing here. Most myths don't end this way. They end with punishment or triumph, death or madness, rarely with contentment. But the story of Eros and Psyche resists that pattern. Instead, it becomes ordinary. Love, after all, is not the arrow's flight or the dramatic revelation. It's the small acts, waking, listening, forgiving. It's learning to trust again after trust is broken. It's waiting, sorting seeds, refusing food in the underworld, opening a box not out of greed, but curiosity. Eros had power, but Psyche had persistence. She walked through solitude, suspicion, and silence. She did not conquer love. She met it slowly, repeatedly, often clumsily. That's what makes her story enduring. Even today, in languages far removed from Homer's Greek, her name survives. Psyche, the word for soul, for breath, for the part of us that waits, questions, learns. And Eros, he still flies through literature and culture stripped of his wings, often reduced to holiday cards and heart-shaped candies. But somewhere, behind all the modern glitter, is the story of a god who learned what it meant to love not by striking others, but by being struck himself, the god of love, undone by love. In the end, their story isn't one of divine spectacle, but of something slower, quieter, something that lingers after the ceremony is over. The simple truth that to love, truly, is to reveal oneself, and that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is to remain, even after the mystery fades. Reflection. The myth of Eros and Psyche is not a romance in the modern sense. It is a meditation on maturity, on what happens when the illusion of love dissolves, and we are left with each other, imperfect and enduring. In a pantheon of thunder, blood, and betrayal, their story stands apart not because it avoids those things, but because it survives them. Perhaps, after all the noise of myth has settled, we are left not with arrows or palaces, but with something far more powerful, a soul that endured, and a love that learned. Hermes and the inventory of Olympus. Long before he became the winged messenger of Olympus, the guide of souls, the trickster diplomat, and the patron of travelers, merchants, and thieves, Hermes was a newborn, not metaphorically, not symbolically, a literal infant. But this was no ordinary baby. The myth begins quietly, in a cave in Arcadia, where the nymph Maia, daughter of Atlas and lover of Zeus, gave birth to her son. There were no divine fanfares, no celestial signs, just a hidden cave, tucked away from the jealous gaze of Hera, and a child who arrived with the sort of precocious intelligence that should, by all laws of nature, be impossible. Hermes was clever from the start. By the time the sun had set on the day of his birth, he had already grown bored with the slow rhythms of infancy, swaddled in his blankets and left alone for a nap. Hermes didn't cry or sleep. He got up, toddled out of the cave, and promptly invented the first musical instrument known to man or god. He killed a tortoise, using its shell, stretched sinews, and his own improvisational genius. He crafted the lyre, an instrument that would later become sacred to Apollo, god of music. But for Hermes, it was simply a distraction, a pleasant tune to hum while he plotted his next move, because what Hermes really wanted was cattle, specifically Apollo's cattle. Yes, the god of the sun, prophecy, and poetry had a herd of divine cows, and Hermes, hours old and still smelling faintly of amniotic godliness, decided to steal them. Why? No one quite knows. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps he wanted attention. Or perhaps this was simply his nature, mischief wrapped in logic, impulse dressed as ingenuity. That evening, as twilight deepened over the hills of Thessaly, Hermes set his plan in motion. He crept into the meadow where Apollo's cattle grazed and began his theft not with chaos, but with strategy. First, he reversed their hooves, not literally, but he crafted clever sandals for their feet that pointed backward, so their tracks would appear to lead in the opposite direction. Then, he disguised his own footprints by walking backward himself, sometimes in the shape of a zigzag, sometimes lifting himself with makeshift crutches to avoid leaving marks at all. He stole 50 cattle, not one or two, and then, with a determined, nearly bureaucratic precision, he led them quietly away from the meadow and toward a hidden grove near the Alpheus River. But he didn't stop there. In a strange and symbolic act, Hermes sacrificed 2 of the cattle to the 12 Olympians, even though there were, at that time, only 11 recognized gods. It was a bold move. By performing the sacred rites himself, Hermes was essentially claiming a place at the table. He, a newborn, was preparing his resume. The next morning, Apollo discovered the theft. The sun god was not easily fooled. While the tracks led nowhere coherent, he was, after all, the god of prophecy. He saw through illusions, riddles, and misdirection. Eventually, his search brought him to Maia's cave. Hermes, once again swaddled and suspiciously innocent-looking, pretended to be asleep. Apollo was not amused. He accused the infant outright. Maia, scandalized, defended her child. "He's only a day old," she said. "How could he steal anything?" Hermes opened one eye, burped, and insisted on his innocence. He even recited a poem he had just invented about how unreasonable it was to blame a newborn for livestock theft. It might have worked, except that Hermes was still wearing the sandals he'd made to reverse the cow's tracks. Apollo dragged him to Olympus. And so, for the first time, Hermes was introduced to the court of the gods, not as a guest, not as a son, but as a suspect. Zeus, his father, presided over the complaint. He was familiar with mischief. He had, after all, fathered most of the troublemakers on Olympus. He listened. He smiled. And then, when Hermes tried to lie again, Zeus laughed, not in anger, in admiration. This child, barely born, had stolen from Apollo, covered his tracks, and performed a sacrificial rite in an effort to elevate himself to divinity. It was audacious. It was clever. It was very Hermes. The matter might have ended there had Hermes not taken a bold step. He offered Apollo the lyre. This was not a bribe. It was an exchange of domains, a gesture of peace. The lyre, crafted from a tortoise's shell and musical intuition, enchanted Apollo instantly. The god of music had never heard such sounds. In that moment, something changed. Apollo, who had arrived as an offended victim, left as an admirer. He not only forgave Hermes, but gifted him a golden staff, the caduceus, which would become his symbol. Hermes was no longer a criminal. He was now the official messenger of the gods. And yet, as the meeting ended, and Olympus returned to its usual rhythms, one quiet fact remained. Hermes had still stolen the cows, and he never returned them. By the time Hermes was old enough to lace his own sandals, he had already stolen sacred cattle, invented the lyre, negotiated with Apollo, and gained official divine employment. Not bad for someone whose job title remained frustratingly vague. Messenger of the gods. Yes. Guide of souls. Also yes. God of thieves, merchants, travelers, herdsmen, and unexpected deliveries. All of the above. Hermes did not rule a domain like Poseidon with his oceans, or Ares with his battlefield. His realm was in between, roads, doorways, messages, boundaries. He was the god you didn't pray to in temples, you prayed to him on the way to temples. He was present at the start of things, and the end, and quite often, in the middle, holding a list and asking, "Are you sure that's what you meant?" It made him indispensable, and therefore, mostly ignored. Olympus was a busy place. Zeus had thunder to manage. Hera was busy orchestrating the collapse of Zeus's latest affair. Athena kept inventing laws no one could enforce. Apollo performed music no one had requested, but But Hermes kept things moving. He delivered messages, not always letters. Sometimes thoughts, sometimes prophecies, sometimes complicated grudges, sealed in metaphor. He could travel between realms, Olympus, Earth, the
underworld, not because he was powerful, but because no one ever bothered to stop him. He wore the patassos, a winged traveler's cap, and winged sandals called tangled, both of which made him look perpetually like someone who'd arrived 5 minutes early, but didn't plan to stay. One of his lesser-known duties was inventory, not in the dramatic sense. Hermes was tasked, unofficially, with keeping track of things on Olympus, divine tools, lost relics, sacred animals, family feuds. He maintained a mental ledger because no one else would. Example, Poseidon's trident, currently in the Sea of Corinth. Last seen skewering a dolphin in a minor dispute. Hera's diadem, misplaced, probably buried in a box of old grudges. Zeus's thunderbolts, all present, -1, which Hermes may have borrowed for a lighting demonstration that went badly. And then there was the staff, the caduceus, a slender rod entwined with 2 snakes, topped with wings. The snakes, it said, had once been fighting until Hermes struck the ground between them and brought peace. They coiled around his staff and never left. This symbol would become deeply associated with diplomacy, trade, and medicine, not because Hermes healed, but because he moved quickly between causes and outcomes, between suffering and solution. The caduceus, unlike the thunderbolt or trident, didn't destroy, it signaled negotiation. Hermes was also the psychopomp, a soft-sounding word for a solemn job, guiding souls to the underworld, not judging, not punishing, just escorting. He walked beside the dead as they crossed into Hades' realm, whispering comfort or distraction, whatever they needed. He did not weep for them, but he did not forget them either. Hermes understood the weight of transitions, from life to death, from silence to speech, from message to meaning. He was there when Persephone returned from the underworld in spring, and when Orpheus looked back, breaking the spell. He watched, always just out of focus. It made him lonely, not in the tragic, theatrical sense of a cursed hero, but in the way of someone who is always on the move, always serving others moments. He had no throne, no army, no sacred mountain. He slept where he happened to land. He ate where he was welcome. He was everyone's guest and no one's host. But he watched everything. He saw the rise of Athens, the fall of Troy. He watched Helen blush. He saw Odysseus lie with great enthusiasm. He watched mortals invent laws, coinage, and gossip. He was not jealous nor impressed. He simply took notes. His most famous job, of course, was during the Trojan War. When Paris stole Helen, Hermes delivered the messages. When Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite quarreled over the golden apple, Hermes was the one who escorted them to the mortal prince to be judged. It was an impossible job escorting 3 divine egos to a beauty contest where only one could win. He did it anyway, with a calm expression and sandals that never scuffed the marble later. During the war itself, Hermes remained mostly neutral. He preferred not to take sides, not because he lacked opinion, but because sides slow things down. And Hermes, above all, valued motion. Even his lovers were often fleeting. He fathered many children. Pan, the goat-footed god of wild things. Hermaphroditus, whose union with the nymph Samis created the first dual-sex being, Autolycus, the grandfather of Odysseus and patron of cunning. But Hermes rarely stayed long. His relationships were like his flights, brief, brilliant, and then gone. And yet, for all this transience, he was trustworthy. When the gods needed a secret kept or a soul delivered, they called for Hermes. Not because he was noble, but because he was reliable. He didn't judge. He didn't linger. He just got things done. He was also one of the few gods who could lie to Zeus and get away with it. Why? Because Hermes told such good lies that they almost became truth. He lied like a poet, like a diplomat, like someone who knew how to stretch reality just far enough to make it interesting, but not so far that it unraveled. Even Zeus admired that. But one wonders, amid all the motion and messages, did Hermes ever sit still? Did he ever stop moving? Did the god of transitions ever long for permanence? It's unclear. Myths don't say. But perhaps, every now and then, on a quiet evening between assignments, Hermes looked at his own ledger, the ever-growing inventory of gods and mortals, and wondered where he himself belonged. There is no monument to Hermes. Not really. No towering statue carved from ivory. No vast temple with gold-veined walls. No grand cult that built cities in his name. He did not demand sacrifice. He did not demand much at all. And yet, in every Greek city, at nearly every crossroad, travelers passed Hermes' plain stone markers topped with a head, often his, and somewhat comically, an exposed phallus. These weren't meant to shock, but to protect, to bless the journey ahead, to mark transitions from town to road, from certainty to the unknown. They were crude, humble objects, and that's the point. Hermes was not the god of destinations. He was the god of getting there. That's what makes him different. The other Olympians ruled over powers that were fixed, elemental, grand, thunder, sea, harvest, war. Hermes governed. What passed between those things? The letter, not the message. The silence before the lie. The breath before death. The glance before a decision is made. He was the connective tissue of the divine. This made him useful. But it also made him forgettable. Not because he lacked importance, but because, like the wind or time, he was always just passing through. A flicker of movement, a whisper that something had changed. He became central to countless stories, yet almost never the focus. It was Hermes who guided Perseus to find Medusa, giving him winged sandals and a mirrored shield. It was Hermes who warned Odysseus about Circe's potions, giving him the herb moly to resist her spells. It was Hermes who brought dreams to sleeping mortals, sliding in and out of consciousness without ever being noticed. And it was Hermes, always, who guided the souls of the dead, the psychopomp. That strange, delicate task, to lead a soul out of the world, not by dragging or forcing, but by accompanying. He did not mourn the dead. He respected them. He walked beside them down to the banks of the river Styx, handed them off to Charon, and returned without fanfare. Hermes saw every soul, kings and beggars, heroes and cowards, children and old men. He remembered none of their names and all of their burdens. But even a god gets tired. There are myths, rare, quiet ones, that suggest Hermes, from time to time, would disappear, not vanish, just leave. He would walk alone into the mortal world, disguised, as always, as a traveler, a shepherd, a beggar, not to test mortals, like Zeus often did, but to rest among them, to forget his job for a while, to exist not as function, but as form. You might have passed him once, a man with kind eyes, who asked for directions, a stranger who fixed a broken wheel on your cart, someone who smiled and said, "Don't take that road," without explanation. Hermes never needed worship, he needed movement. And when civilizations changed, when Rome rose, when the old gods fell, Hermes did not rage or fade. He simply adjusted. He became Mercury, a god of commerce, of messages, of currency. Still in motion. In the Middle Ages, alchemists gave his name to a mysterious force. Mercury is a symbol of transformation, of opposites joined together, a principle that explained why change happens, not violent change, essential change. Hermes became the god of alchemy, not in the sense of gold making, but of in-betweenness, between male and female, between matter and spirit, between the known and unknown. And even today, you'll find him misunderstood, simplified on ambulances and medical logos. Is Caduceus mistaken for Asclepius' healing rod, a symbol misapplied? Perhaps, but strangely fitting. After all, Isn't healing just another transition? From sickness to health, from fear to calm. That's Hermes.
The god who doesn't ask for prayers, only attention. Who doesn't punish mistakes, but nudges you forward anyway. Who doesn't linger, but always returns. And while others fight for thrones or praise, Hermes counts the steps, tracks the paths, and remembers what was carried. He's there when you start something new, when you finish something old, when you feel the first breeze of change and wonder what it means. He will not explain it, but he will walk with you just long enough to remind you that nothing stays still. Not even the gods. Reflection. Hermes teaches us that motion is sacred, that in the most mundane transitions, leaving a home, sending a letter, walking away from a conversation, there is divinity. Not in the end, but in the act of going, of carrying, of becoming. He's the god of what happens while you're busy doing something else. And if you ever feel like the world is changing beneath your feet, and you don't quite know why, you're not alone. Hermes has already passed through. Demeter's bargain. The year the earth held its breath in a quiet field of barley, beneath the gentle warmth of a late spring sun, a girl laughed. Her name was Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain, of orchards, of ripening wheat and golden summers. Persephone wasn't just her daughter, she was her entire world, her shadow, her joy, her reason for rising each morning and pouring life into the soil. They lived not in a grand palace, but among the fields, among farmers. Demeter, unlike most Olympians, took interest in mortals. She taught them to plant in rows, to watch the skies, to harvest in season, and Persephone danced behind her, bright and curious, and then, one day, she vanished. There are different tellings, different flowers, different witnesses, but the heart of the story never changes. Persephone was in a meadow. She bent to pick a bloom. Sometimes it's a narcissus, sometimes a rare flower that had never been seen before. And then, without warning, the earth split open, a chasm, a rupture in the calm green world. From it rose Hades, god of the underworld, not with fire and screams, but with shadows and silence. He reached out, he took her, and then he was gone. The earth sealed behind them. No one saw, except one, Hecate, the torch-bearing goddess of crossroads, who had heard the cries, but not seen the act, and Helios, the sun, who sees all things, and did not look away. Demeter searched. At first, calmly, she asked the dryads, the river gods, the winds, then more frantically. Days became weeks. The fields she had blessed turned brown with neglect. Mortals waited for rain that never came. Animals grew thin. The rivers slowed. Demeter wandered further, disguised now as an old woman, dusty and worn. She did not bring famine, but her absence did. Eventually, she came to the house of a mortal king, Celeus, in the city of Eleusis. His daughter had found the goddess by a well, resting in the shade, and brought her home out of pity. Demeter said little. She called herself Doso. She took work as a nursemaid. But even in disguise, her grief seeped into the walls. The women of the house felt it first. A sadness that hung between spoons and stares. The crops in the city's fields grew erratic, sometimes too tall, then shriveled overnight. Bees made no honey. Fruit ripened too early and soured by noon. Demeter, still silent, tried to find comfort in raising Demophon, the infant prince. She grew attached, and one night, in a misguided attempt to give him divine protection, she placed him in the hearth. Fire, an old, forgotten ritual meant to burn away mortality. She was interrupted. His mother screamed. The spell broke. The child was unharmed, but the truth spilled out. Demeter dropped her disguise. The house filled with golden light. The family fell to their knees. And she, tired, sorrowful, spoke not with thunder, but with absence. Your lands will not grow, she said, until my daughter is returned. Back on Olympus, the gods had begun to whirring. Offerings had stopped. Temples were empty. Mortals, preoccupied with hunger and loss, had no time for worship. Fires smoldered out. No wine was poured. No statues were clean. Zeus, king of the gods, realized something profound. Without Demeter, the world did not function. He sent for Hermes. Go to Hades, he said. Find Persephone. And so Hermes, light-footed and neutral, descended through hidden caves and dark tunnels until he reached the underworld. There, he found Persephone not a prisoner, exactly, but not free either. She sat beside Hades. Her eyes were distant, her posture still, her mouth neither smiling nor frowning. And in her hand 3 seeds, pomegranate seeds, just a few. Hades claimed he had not forced her to eat, that she had grown hungry, that she had chosen, that he had offered not chains, but a throne. This is where the myth becomes quiet, difficult. Did Persephone love him? Was she coerced? Was it a trick? The answer, like most truths, may be somewhere in between. But she had eaten, and by ancient law, eating food in the underworld meant you belonged to it. Hermes returned to Olympus with the news. Demeter listened. Her face was stone. She would not return to Olympus. She would not let the earth wake. She would not allow spring to come. And Zeus, faced with the silence of his once faithful mortals, agreed to a compromise. Persephone would return, but only for part of the year. For the months she had not eaten, she would be with her mother. For the months bound by the seeds, she would remain in the underworld. And so, the world changed. Persephone rose. Demeter wept not with grief, but with relief. The sun warmed the soil. Trees shook off their stillness. Crops unfurled in the fields, like waking children. But Demeter knew it would not last. Every year, as Persephone descended again, the goddess of harvest would hold her breath. The ground would chill, the leaves would turn, the bees would sleep, and winter would begin. And so, we pause here with Persephone returned, but not rescued, with Demeter smiling, but not whole, with the world turning, now and forever, in a cycle of loss and reunion. The world, which had been silent and cold for so long, stirred once again. The grasses grew green. The rivers ran faster. Lambs were born. Bees returned to the wild time. And the wind carried the soft, clean scent of beginning. To mortals, it was spring. But to Demeter, it was a reunion. Persephone had returned. They embraced in the fields, no heralds, no fanfare, just the goddesses who had waited through a kind of death. There are no verses in Homer or Hesiod to describe the first words spoken between them. The myths go silent. Perhaps they said nothing. Perhaps they simply stood, hands held, eyes wide, breathing the same air again. The earth responded, not to commands, but to the emotional thaw, as if the ground itself was waiting for Demeter's heart to soften. But even in this moment, both knew it would not last. Persephone had eaten the seeds, and so, for a portion of every year, she belonged to the underworld. We don't know how long exactly. Some say 3 months, some say 6. The number doesn't matter as much as the feeling that every joy is now followed by an inevitable parting. And this, perhaps more than any single act of vengeance or divine wrath, became Demeter's most powerful expression of emotion. The seasons. When Persephone is with her, the world blooms. The sun lingers, the fields flourish. This is spring and summer. Demeter's joy. When Persephone descends, the light shortens, the crops retreat, the frost returns. This is autumn and winter. Demeter's grief. But grief is not the end of this story. In the quiet city of Eleusis, where Demeter had once wandered as a nursemaid, a new kind of ritual began to take shape. It was not demanded by Olympus. It was not decreed by Zeus. It began with the people. They remembered the goddess in disguise, the old woman at the well, the grieving mother, the flame in the hearth. They built her a temple, not tall and proud, like those of Athena or Apollo, but deep and solemn. Inside, they held mysteries, sacred rites, rituals of initiation, death, and rebirth. The Eleusinian mysteries, as they came to be known, became one of the most important religious traditions in the ancient Greek world. We know very little about what happened inside. It was forbidden to speak of it. Even Plato, who wrote endlessly of gods and virtues, said almost nothing. Those who were initiated believed they would be granted insight into the cycle of life and death and, more importantly, comfort in facing it. Demeter became more than a goddess of crops. She became a symbol of loss, yes, but also of return. She was a reminder that even when something vanishes into the earth, not all is lost, that the soil, for all its darkness, is also where things grow. Persephone, too, changed. She was no longer just a daughter, no longer just a maiden in a meadow. She became a queen. Queen of the underworld. Not a hostage, but a presence. Not the ruler of death, but its balance. When she walked through the halls of Hades, she was not weeping. She brought with her the scent of the upper world, the memory of wine, the whisper of wildflowers. To the dead, she was a comfort. To the living, a promise. And yet, for Demeter, each year still brought sorrow. Her daughter would leave, again, every time, but she no longer stopped the world. She marked it. With falling leaves, with frost, with long shadows and silent fields, and in doing so, she taught mortals something profound. That life is not meant to be constant. That everything which lives must change. That even grief, when allowed to pass through its own seasons, can become a kind of strength. We don't know what Demeter and Persephone said to one another during those months together. Did they speak of the pomegranate? Did they speak of Hades? Did they smile through their days, or count them with quiet dread? No text tells us, but perhaps, in the gap between myth and silence, we are meant to find our own answers, to sit with the fact that love, even divine love, must make peace with change. And still, one wonders, if the seeds had never been eaten, would the world have remained in endless summer? Would we have survived a world without grief, without pause, without winter? The pact had been made. Persephone would spend part of the year in the world above, and part below. No battles had been fought, no monsters slain, no walls broken or empires shattered. And yet, this single compromise between a grieving mother, a captive daughter, and a shadowed husband would shape not only myth, but the rhythm of life itself. Before this, the world knew no seasons, no cold, no planting, no harvest. Time simply was, an eternal now. And so, this moment, this shift in the divine calendar became more than personal grief. It became the foundation of human time. Demeter returned to Olympus, but her presence there was occasional. Her true temple was now the earth itself, the fields, the furrows, the slow, sacred turning of the year. She no longer walked among mortals, but they remembered her constantly. Every time a seed was pressed into the soil, every time the first green sprout appeared after winter, every time bread rose over the fire, she had no thunderbolt, no trident, no flaming chariot. Her power was patience. It's easy to miss how rare that is among the gods. Where Ares raged and Zeus roared, Demeter simply waited, waited for the sun to return, waited for the stalks to rise, waited for her daughter, again and again, to walk back from the dark. Persephone changed too. The girl who had once giggled in barley fields now walked with quiet authority through the halls of Hades. She was no longer an accessory to someone else's story. She had become the hinge between life and death. The ancients called her Cori the Maiden, but they also called her Dread Persephone. In her, two truths existed at once, the innocence of spring and the severity of endings. Some say she came to love Hades, others say she remained bound. But perhaps love is not the point, perhaps acceptance is. Persephone did not escape the underworld. She returned from it, by choice, by agreement, by transformation. And in doing so, she gave mortals a framework to understand the incomprehensible, because the ancient Greeks did not believe in linear time. They believed in cycles, that all things return, that death leads to rebirth, that what is lost can bloom again, though never in quite the same form. That was the secret of the Eleusinian mysteries. No one truly knows what was revealed inside the sanctuary. Initiates were sworn to secrecy. The penalty for speaking was death, and no one ever broke the silence. But those who emerged from the rites reported the same feeling, that they no longer feared death, not because they were promised paradise, not because they believed they would be rewarded, but because they had seen, somehow, that death is part of the pattern, that beneath the ground, life waits, just as Demeter had waited, just as Persephone had risen. This was not comfort in the modern sense. It was not a fairy tale. It was structure. It was sense in a senseless world. And for a civilization built on farming, the lessons were practical as much as spiritual. Sow, wait, reap, rest. Loss is part of the process. The winter is not a failure. It is a necessary pause. Even today, long after the temples have crumbled and the rites have faded, the story remains. Not as doctrine, but as instinct. Every time you feel the first chill of autumn, something ancient stirs. Every time the buds appear after snow, something ancient answers. You know this story, even if you've never heard it told, because it is in the rhythm of your breath, the ebb of your energy, the turning of your life's own seasons. So what, in the end, was Demeter's true gift? It wasn't wheat, it wasn't law, it wasn't even her love. It was the agreement to let go. To allow something beloved to leave, to trust that it might return, to survive the wait. That is what made her divine. Not power, but patience, and not the illusion that everything lasts forever, but the wisdom to build a life anyway. Reflection. The tale of Demeter and Persephone is not about drama, but about durability. It's the first myth to quietly admit that love is not always victorious, that compromise is not failure, that grief does not destroy the divine, it reshapes it. In the turning of the year, Demeter whispers, everything will change, but not everything will be lost. Hephaestus forged in fire. The lame god who built Olympus bore, he was a master of metal, before he forged thunderbolts and palaces, before he married the goddess of beauty. Hephaestus was just a child, and not a wanted one. He was born to Hera alone. No father, no union, no shared lineage with Zeus. It was, in a way, a political move, an act of spite. Hera, jealous that Zeus had given birth to Athena from his own forehead, a feat one asked for, but which Olympus never forgot, decided she, too, would create a child without a mate. And so Hephaestus was born, but he was not glorious, not golden, not swift or strong or shining. He was born lame. The myths do not explain in detail, perhaps a twisted foot, perhaps both legs, perhaps more. But his body did not match the gleaming expectations of divinity. He did not float, did not roar, did not inspire and Hera, upon seeing him, threw him from Olympus. It's told plainly. A mother rejected her son at birth, cast him out of heaven. The fall lasted a day and a night, and when he landed, it was in the sea. There, Thetis, a sea nymph, and her sister Eurynome found him, crumpled and broken. They did not send him back. They did not ask questions. They simply took him in. For 9 years, he lived beneath the waves, hidden from Olympus, forgotten, but not idle. Even as a boy, Hephaestus began to make things. Not beautiful things, at first useful things, tools, machines, hinges, mechanisms that moved where he could not. His hands, slow and deliberate, learned the secrets of metal. He studied the way fire softened iron, how bronze bent, how gold behaved when coaxed, not conquered. He built a forge underwater, fueled by volcanic vents, and from the silence of exile, he began to create. When he was ready, he sent a gift, a throne, made of shining metal and enchanted with invisible chains. He sent it to Hera, a peace offering, a trick, a statement. She sat on it, and immediately, she could not rise. The chair clamped shut around her like a trap. No one on Olympus could break the spell. Not Ares, not Apollo, not even Zeus. The throne was too clever, its logic too precise, its design too flawless. And only one god knew How to undo it. Hephaest US. The son they had forgotten, the god they had discarded. Now they wanted him back, but he refused. He stayed in his cave, at his anvil, quiet and busy. He had no interest in praise. He had no desire for Olympus. Eventually, Dionysus, god of wine and persuasion, was sent to fetch him. The story says he got Hephaestus drunk and convinced him to return. Others say Hephaestus returned only because he wished to negotiate. Either way, he arrived not crawling, not groveling, but riding on a mechanical mule of his own making, with bronze limbs and golden hooves. He reached Hera. He looked her in the eye, and he released her. No apology is recorded. No reconciliation is described. Olympus does not celebrate tenderness. But from that moment on, Hephaestus had a place, a forge, a workshop, a role. He became the smith of the gods, not because he wanted revenge, not because he wanted glory, but because he had skills they needed. He forged Zeus's thunderbolt hills, shield Helios's chariot, Hermes's winged sandals, built automata, golden women who could speak and walk and surf. He built tripods that rolled around the palace. On their own, he created gifts, weapons, and wonders, but still, he limped. And still, he was mocked, especially by gods who had never built a single thing. So we pause here, with Hephaestus returned, but not revered. Welcomed, but never quite equal. A god whose body was marked, but whose hands were steady. And we ask, in a world that values perfection, what happens to those who build it, but do not embody it? On Olympus, Hephaestus rarely joined the banquets. He wasn't the type. While the other gods drank ambrosia and told stories, he stayed in his forge. There was always something to fix. Some mechanism that had failed, some axle that squeaked, some grand divine symbol that needed EFO or GING. Immortality doesn't mean maintenance free. Even gods wear things out. Zeus's thunderbolts needed constant repair. The winged sandals of Hermes had to be rebalanced after every trip to the underworld. The chariot of Apollo had to be polished, heat-shielded, and calibrated to avoid scorching the earth. And so, while others basked in worship, Hephaestus kept working. He didn't demand temples, but he had them quiet ones, often at the edges of cities, near foundries and forges. His followers were not priests in robes. They were craftsmen, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, and metal workers. They honored him not with poetry, but with calloused hands. To them, Hephaestus was more than a god. He was a reflection, proof that flawed bodies could hold divine skill, that labor was sacred, that function could be more meaningful than beauty. But Olympus did not see him that way. They gave him Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, as a wife. Was it a gift, a reward, a joke? It's unclear. Myths disagree. Some say it was a political marriage arranged by Zeus to tame Aphrodite's endless allure. Others say Hephaestus demanded her hand in exchange for releasing Hera from the enchanted throne. What is certain is this: it did not go well. Aphrodite did not love Hephaestus. She was radiant, flirtatious, spontaneous. He was methodical, quiet, bent over molten bronze. She found pleasure elsewhere with Ares, the god of war. Their affair became the worst-kept secret in Olympus. Hephaestus knew. And, true to form, he did not rage. He did not challenge Ares to a duel. He built a trap. An invisible net, fine as silk but strong as iron. He laced it over his marriage bed. Then he left the room. When Aphrodite and Ares embraced, the net snapped tight. They were caught, exposed, twisted in golden wire, naked and humiliated. Hephaestus summoned the other gods not out of vengeance, but to show them what they had made of him, to remind them that the god they mocked could bind even the strongest among them. The gods laughed. Of course they did. They jeered at Ares, marveled at the craftsmanship of the trap, teased Aphrodite. But they did not comfort Hephaestus. He let them go. Eventually. What else was there to do? And then he returned to his forge. because he always returned to the forge. It's important to understand something. Hephaestus was not weak. He was not passive. He simply chose not to compete on their terms. His revenge was not loud. It was measured. His anger did not boil. It simmered, calculated, channeled into design. Unlike the others, his power was not destruction. It was construction. And construction takes time. One of his greatest works was the shield of Achilles, made during the Trojan War, when Thetis, his old sea mother, came to him begging for armor to protect her son. He did not hesitate. He forged the shield not as a weapon, but as a world. It held the earth, the sky, and the sea, cities of peace and cities at war. Fields being plowed. Lovers dancing, judges listening. Children playing. It was everything Achilles was fighting for and everything he was doomed to lose. Hephaestus did not sculpt vengeance, he sculpted balance. This was his quiet rebellion, to create in a world obsessed with conquest. To repair, even when surrounded by betrayal. To build, even after being thrown away. And yet, one wonders, did he ever stop to admire his own work? Did he ever lift his eyes from the anvil, look at the world he had helped to shape, and feel pride? Or did he always see the flaw, the imperfection, the thing that could have been tighter, lighter, smoother? Because that's the curse of the builder. To see what others praise and still feel it's not enough. To fix what no one else notices. To be needed, but rarely seen. Long after the Trojan War faded into myth, long after Olympus grew tired of its own dramas, Hephaestus still worked. The fires of his forge never went out. In fact, mortals believed they could see them deep beneath the surface of the earth. When a volcano erupted, they said Hephaestus was forging something mighty. When the ground trembled, they imagined his hammer striking an anvil in the dark. His forge was placed beneath Mount Etna, in Sicily, a mountain that still smokes to this day. But by now, Hephaestus had become more than a myth. He had become a principle, a force not of war, nor wisdom, but of craft, of resilience, of slow, steady creation. And it is worth remembering, he was the only Olympian who made things. The others governed, demanded, fought, inspired, but Hephaestus built. He did not chase greatness, he fabricated it. He married again, some say, to Aglaia, one of the Graces, a goddess of splendor and kindness, a gentler, more fitting match than Aphrodite, who had always been at odds with his fire and patience. But even then, his love stories were footnotes. Hephaestus was never defined by romance. His stories are not about conquest or betrayal. They are about labor and the dignity of it. In the ancient world, to work with one's hands was often considered low. But Hephaestus challenged that idea. He was divine not in spite of his forge, but because of it. His hands were dirty, his brow was scarred, and his gait was imperfect, but from his workshop came the tools of gods and the defenses of heroes. He even built automata, what we'd now call robots, metal creatures that moved on their own. Golden maidens who could speak and serve, dogs made of silver who guarded palaces, statues that walked. His forge was, in essence, the first laboratory of innovation. And while he is often remembered as lame, broken, or mocked, Hephaestus outlasted his mockers. Ares, for all his bluster, lost every war. Apollo, for all his beauty, could not keep love. But Hephaestus, he kept making. When the Romans adopted the Greek gods, Hephaestus became Vulcan. He was still a god of fire, but now also of destructive power. Volcanoes, yes, but also industry. He became a patron of blacksmiths, engineers, machinists. In the modern world, his name is remembered not in song, but in steel plants and military codenames and welding helmets. And yet, behind every bolt tightened, every engine tested, every structure assembled with care, Hephaestus remains, not in form. In function. His is not the myth of a hero. It is the myth of a craftsman, a reminder that strength is not always visible, that value is not always glamorous, that progress does not shout. It clanks, it grinds, it glows red hot behind closed doors. It is slow, painful, repetitive, and sacred reflection. In the end, Hephaestus represents something rare in mythology, the worker god, the one who was rejected but returned, who was mocked, but whose creations outlasted his critics. He is not a god of beginnings or endings, but of process, of the long, often unseen road between idea and reality. So if you've ever felt unseen, overlooked, or discarded, Hephaestus offers no comfort, no miracle, no escape, but he offers this build. Anyway, would you like to continue to Story 6, the madness of Dionysus, when the gods brought ecstasy and fear?